I'd never been the kind of person who was afraid of the woods. Growing up, my family used to camp every summer. My dad would always joke about the things that go bump in the night, but I never believed in that stuff. The woods were peaceful to me, a place where the chaos of the world couldn't follow. As I got older, I started camping alone. At first, it was just a way to get away from people, but it became something I looked forward to. I liked the quiet, the solitude, the way the forest could swallow you whole if you let it. So, when life started feeling overwhelming again, I decided it was time for another solo trip. This time, I picked a spot deeper in the woods than I'd ever been before. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing I'd found on an old map, about a 2-hour hike from the trailhead. I figured I wouldn't see another soul out there, and that was exactly what I wanted. The first day was perfect. The hike was tough, but the clearing was even better than I'd hoped. Tall pines surrounded the site, and a little stream ran nearby. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and just sat there for a while, listening to the wind in the trees. By the time night fell, I felt more relaxed than I had in weeks. That night, I didn't sleep much, but that was normal for me. The forest was alive with sounds, crickets chirping, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Around 3 a.m., I thought I heard footsteps, but when I unzipped the tent and looked outside, there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably just a deer or something and went back to sleep. The second day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the area, climbing over fallen logs and checking out the stream. By the time the sun started to set, I was back at the campsite, cooking a little meal over the fire. That's when I started to feel it. This uneasiness. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a weird sensation like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but every time I looked, there was nothing there. The forest was too quiet though, no crickets, no birds, just silence. I shook it off and told myself I was overthinking. But when I sat down by the fire after dinner, I heard it. Footsteps. At first they were faint, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. They weren't quick, like an animal darting through the brush. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. I stood up, gripping my flashlight, and called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No answer, just the sound of the fire crackling and my heart pounding in my ears. The footsteps stopped. I shined the flashlight into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth, but all I saw were shadows. After a few minutes, I sat back down, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I eventually crawled into my tent, but I didn't feel safe. Every little sound outside made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something brushing against my tent. It wasn't the wind. This was slow, deliberate, like someone dragging their hand along the fabric. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the knife I'd packed and held it tight, too scared to make a sound. The brushing stopped, and then I heard it. Breathing. It was faint at first, but as I strained to listen, I realized it was coming from right outside the tent. Slow, steady breaths, just inches from where I was lying. I stayed completely still, my heart hammering in my chest. The breathing stopped after what felt like hours, but I didn't move. I didn't dare. When the first light of dawn broke, I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside. My legs felt like jelly, and I was shaking so hard I could barely hold the knife. The clearing looked normal, except for the footprints. They were barefoot, human, and they circled my tent. I didn't bother packing everything up. I grabbed my backpack and ran, leaving the tent and most of my gear behind. I don't know who or what was out there with me, and I don't want to know. All I know is I'll never go camping alone again. I moved into a small apartment a little over 6 months ago. It's not much, an old building in a quiet neighborhood, but it was affordable and seemed like a good place to get some space after a rough breakup. I didn't care much about the weird noises or the peeling paint. I just needed a place to stay. The landlord was an older guy who seemed nice enough, but he gave me a weird vibe when I asked about the basement. We were walking through the place, and when we got to the door, he just said, "There's not much down there, just some storage. Keep the door locked, all right?" He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. I thought it was a little strange, but I didn't think much of it. After all, basements in old buildings are usually full of junk, right? The first few days were fine. I settled in, got used to the sounds of the place, the creaking floors, the pipes rattling at night. It wasn't perfect, but I was okay with it. Then, around the fourth night, I heard something strange. It was a faint scratching noise, like nails on wood coming from below. It stopped for a moment, then started again, persistent and irregular. I thought it was probably just a rodent or something stuck down there. It's an old building, after all. I tried to ignore it, but the sound got to me. By the next evening, it was back. The scratching, only louder now. I knew it was coming from the basement, so I did what anyone would do. I grabbed a flashlight, took a deep breath, and went to investigate. I told myself I was just being paranoid. The door to the basement creaked open, and the smell hit me immediately. Stale, cold air. The stairs were narrow and steep, and I hesitated before stepping down. The scratching had stopped, but I could still hear faint movement, like something was shifting just out of sight. The light flickered once or twice as I moved down the stairs, and I found myself frozen at the bottom. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like I wasn't alone. There was a corner in the basement that was too dark, even with the flashlight shining right on it. Then I saw it. A dark shape, just beyond the edge of the light, moving slightly. My first thought was it was just a shadow, but as I stared, it became clearer. Something was there, just out of reach. I was too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. The scratching started again, louder now, and I swore I saw something shift in the shadows. A hand. A pale, twisted hand. I don't even know how to describe it. The fingers were too long, too thin, and it moved with a kind of jerky, unnatural grace. That's when I ran. I didn't look back. I just bolted up the stairs, slammed the door, and locked it. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't catch my breath. I sat on the floor for a while, staring at the basement door, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was nothing. But the scratching didn't stop. Every night at the same time, it would start up again, faint at first, but getting louder and more frantic. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to it. The worst part was that sometimes I could swear I heard something moving on the other side of my bedroom door, as if whatever was down there had followed me upstairs. I didn't know who to tell. The landlord was avoiding my calls, and I didn't want to seem crazy. But I couldn't stay there anymore. I started sleeping at a friend's place, and whenever I had to go back for a few things, I'd make sure to leave before dark. Last week, I went back to the apartment just to grab some clothes. I hadn't heard the scratching in a few days, and I thought maybe I'd just imagined it all. But when I opened the basement door, I froze. The light was on, and I saw it. Again, that pale, twisted hand, this time pressing against the basement door. I left. I left everything behind. I don't know what's down there, and I don't think I ever want to. But I'm still haunted by the feeling that whatever it is, it's still waiting for me. If you ever hear scratching from your basement, don't go looking for it. Trust me,